The first of our special Saturday at noon talks is on the controversial subject of women tenors and basses in the music of Vivaldi. Have a listen to this. That was the Domine Fili Unigenite from Vivaldi's Gloria, filmed at the Church of the Pieta in Venice by Vivaldi's women and female members of the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. Seen from the altar end, the tenors and basses are on the right, next to the organ, and the sopranos and contraltos in the gallery on the left. The distance between the galleries is about 15 metres. The orchestra is in the main gallery over the west door. As you heard and as you saw, we performed that music with an all-female ensemble, including women singing tenor and bass at pitch, the same as men would do. But was this the way it was done in Vivaldi's day? Let's look at various theories. Firstly, what I call the invisible men theory. Were the men who came to teach or work in the Pieta singing from behind the scenes? Here's an illustration taken from Grevenbot's book of Venetian costumes from about 1755, showing the old organ gallery of the church that was next door to the present one. In the middle we have the senior musician in a red dress. On the left, string players, on the right, singers. Not a man in sight. A later picture by Francesco Guardi, quite a famous picture, shows the visit of the Russian nobility in 1782. There's a gallery on the left, 3 tiers, with singers at the top, violinists in the middle, and lower strings at the bottom. Another theory is what I describe as the instrumental theory. Because there were lots of string players, especially of lower strings, it was perfectly possible to play the tenor and bass parts on cellos and violas, for example. However, this was sacred music, and for religious reasons this absolutely would not have been done. The sacred words had to be heard. A third theory is that of chiavetti, or transposable clefs. In high music you would have high clefs, for example treble clef and C clefs. In low music you would have low clefs, you would have C clefs at the top and bass clef at the bottom, and you could transpose between the two. The problem with this is that in the 18th century we have surviving instruments and we know the pitch of them. The final theory, which is the most plausible and which has been put forward by Andrew Parrott among others, is that the tenor and bass parts were sung up an octave. There is some justification for this. If we look at music of two of the four Ospedali, we do see there was a tradition of what we would, in modern terms, regard as female voice music, where you'd have double soprano, double alto. And if you look at a texture that is scored in the conventional way for soprano, alto, tenor, bass, the soprano and alto are at pitch, the tenor is sung by the second soprano, and the bass is sung by the second alto. Let's see how the octave transposition theory works in practice. Here are the first 10 bars of the vocal writing in Vivaldi's psalm setting Laetatus Sum. I've transcribed the tenor part at sounding pitch. So, for example, in the fourth bar of music, those three Fs, they would be sounding higher than the soprano. The same at the end, the last four notes, the E, D, D, E at the end of the phrase is higher than the soprano. Let's listen to Andrew Parrott's recording of this passage. He was experimenting at this point with the idea of putting the tenor and bass parts up an octave. See what you think. In contrast, let's listen to the Vivaldi's women performance with the tenor and bass sung at normal pitch. Venice had a history of caring for its sick, homeless, poor and orphaned long before the Ospedali Grandi became known as musical institutions. There were four of them, the Pieta, the Incurabili, the Derelitti and the Mendicanti, all hospitals in the original sense of the word, charitable hospices providing a range of services for the needy of Venice. This tradition started to fail in 1797 with the collapse of the Venetian Republic, though the final musical performance at the Pieta was as late as 1840. During the 17th and 18th centuries, they became famous for training female pupils in music, the figlie del coro, and attracting tourists to hear their singers and instrumentalists in religious services and occasional concerts. This provided some much-needed income. Who actually lived at the Pieta? The senior woman was known as the Priora, and in 1718 this was Meneghina. It was a job that rotated every 3 years. So this list dates from 3 years after the composition of Vivaldi's Gloria. And it tells us at the bottom there were at least 767 residents at this time. So this was quite a big set of buildings. It was on the site of the present Pieta Church and the present Metropole Hotel. And if you go through the Metropole Hotel up the staircase to the second floor, that is where Vivaldi had his room. On this page, we see the names of the maestri. At the top is Maestra Meneghina, who was 60, and she was the Priora, the senior woman, a post elected every 3 years. Going down the list, we see the name of Maestra Silvia. She was a soprano soloist in the big oratorio Judita Triumphans, composed in 1716. So she would have been 66 at that time, and the part is a very tricky and very taxing part. So it's interesting to see that someone of her age was given that role, and I think it tells us a bit about attitudes. There were some very talented younger people who did sing and play in their 20s, but the norm was that you really got to the top in this organisation in your 50s and 60s. On this next page we get to the Filia, the junior musicians. At the top we have Filia Barbara, who was the soprano soloist in the Giudice Triumphans, the other soprano soloist. And then going down the list, we get to Candida, who was one of the many cellists, Paulina, a tenor, quite a well-known tenor, Geltruda, for whom Vivaldi wrote his Clare Stelle, a wonderful motet. And further down we get to Anna. Anna is very important because she's our known bass. And she worked on the sort of medical side of the Pieta. She was a nurse. She looked after the nene, the wet nurses. Obviously, with all these babies coming in, they had to have a team of wet nurses to feed them. And she assisted the surgeon. On the final page, we see two of the best-known younger musicians, Anna Maria, who played lots of instruments, and she was known all over Europe, really, and Vivaldi thought so highly of her that he bought her a very expensive violin out of his own pocket. And then we have Polonia, which was a nickname for Apollonia, who started out as a contralto and then a soprano. She was probably the finest singer in the institution. At the very bottom, we have the youngest girls, Fiorina, Antonia, Bastiana, Perpetua and Basilia. And we can see here that Perpetua in 1718 was only 11. So she was quite exceptional because you didn't normally get into the corps of the performing musicians until you were at least 16. Let's look now in more detail at the singers. This data relates to the year 1700, 3 years before Vivaldi started working here, to 1745, 4 years after his death. It comes from the list of Meneghina, which we've already looked at, and other birth and death records from which we've been able to extrapolate who sang and played what. We can see from this table that there were 25 to 30 singers at the Pieta over this period. We can also see the pink bars are the sopranos, the yellow are the contraltos, the light green are the tenors, and the orange the bass. We can see that as you went down in parts, there were fewer singers. The grey bars at the top are singers for whom we do not know their part. And if we look at the 1718 inventory, we see there's a reference to 2 singers, 9 sopranos, 8 contraltos, the contralto tenor, 5 tenors, and 1 bass. This tells us quite a lot about the choral balance. If we assign the people for whom we don't know their part to this table, it looks something like this. At the bottom, I put more than one singer on the bass part, the reason being that we know that Vivaldi wrote pieces with more than one bass part in them. To bring this into the practical modern world, I did a survey starting in 2007, and so far I've had about 150 replies. When I drew up this chart, I'd had 132, and at the top we see what people's, for want of a better word, head registers were. At the bottom in brown we see what their chest registers or natural registers were, and for those who know about passaggio, they gave us passaggio data, that's the green in the middle. That is the transition, which as a trained singer you learn to manage to go between registers without it being noticeable. We had 2 women reporting that they could sing a top G, that is a tone above the top note in Mozart's Queen of the Night. I've heard both these women, and this is true. It's not a squeak, it's a proper note. As indeed at the bottom, the E below the bass stave, bottom note from the person who gave us this sample. One thing we can see is that pitch falls with age. See the blue dotted lines? Although if you look at the red line, this shows us that actually if you are a trained singer and you work on your technique, you can in fact maintain your high notes or even extend them. So here you can see, looking against the notes at the bottom, you can see that 100% of our respondents can sing from B below middle C up to the A above. You can see that 1 person can sing E below the bass stave, 2 can sing G an octave above the treble stave. More interestingly, I think, If we look at the 50% mark, we can see that women can sing D sharp below middle C, or can sing A above top C, A above the stave. Having collected this data, I looked at some Pieta works by Vivaldi and Porpora and tried to map the ranges of the parts onto our graph. These are the ranges of the parts in Vivaldi's In Exitu Israel. So both the soprano and the contralto go down to middle C. The tenor goes down to tenor C. The bass goes down to bottom A. However, only 2% of the notes in this work are below tenor C. Well, that's quite a hectic sing. There's an example of Vivaldi's piccolo style where he sets a lot of text in a very short space of time as a through composed piece, not stopping until he gets to the end. His other more lyrical style is to be found in the third setting of the Magnificat. This is the RV 611 setting. I've given the ranges here in the chart, but the most important thing to say is that in this multi-movement work, all the solos are for sopranos or altos, and they're very contrasting. It's a wonderful work, very much in a later style. Almost foreshadows Mozart. Now, here's a work I want us to look at in detail. This is the Porpora Magnificat for two choirs of 1742, the year after Vivaldi's death. Porpora took over, and during this year, he was only there for a year, but he wrote a lot of music during that time. It's for double choir, so I've had to conflate the ranges of the parts. Lowest soprano note is D above middle C, lowest alto note is A below, lowest tenor note is B flat below middle C, and if you compare the alto and tenor ranges, you see that the tenor is actually higher. Lowest bass note is bottom F. So let's look at the score and see if we can learn something from that. The source is in the British Library. Here's the title page. Magnificat for two choirs with instruments by Nicola Porpora, Maestro del Coro del Pio Ospedali della Pieta in Venezia, 1742. Rather unhelpfully, there are no clefs in the left-hand margin. You have to look at the beginning of the piece to find out where you are. And I'll put in a blue dotted line so you can see where the gap is between the two choirs. So choir 1 above the dotted line would have been on one side of the church, and choir 2 below it would have been on the other side. This is an example of the Venetian polychoral tradition. In blue we have the voices of choir 1. There's no tenor in choir 2. Perhaps the makeup of voices is a reflection of the membership of the choir at the time. You can see here that Porpora gives an alternative upper bass note. This is quite a useful technique actually when introducing female voices to singing low parts. Here's another example of the same technique in a later movement. That's the bass clef, and that's the bass part in choir 1, D, C sharp, A. So what did people at the time think about these low female voices? I suspect they were not that unusual. In the Ballade Veneta of July 1687, we read of Maria Anna Ziani from the Mendicanti. Although a woman, she is endowed naturally with a male voice, but one that is so tender and full, and of such a sweet tone, that she sings baritone with enough grace to transport and captivate the minds of her listeners. I've actually heard women like this myself, and this kind of tone is not uncommon in choirs in Eastern Europe. 70 years later, we hear about another Anna Cremona from the same institution, described as a distinguished bass singer. We're going to end with some discussion of this subject, filmed as part of the documentary in Venice in 2005. And then we'll just conclude with a trio from Vivaldi's Dixit Dominus, RV 595, sung by Margaret Jackson Roberts, bass, Penny Vickers, tenor, and Victoria Cooper, contralto. The more I looked at Vivaldi's music in conjunction with Mickey's research, the more I thought that her hunch that this was performed entirely by a choir of women was correct. Lots of people have said, you know, there couldn't have been women singing bass. The bass parts were played on cellos and double basses. There were no women singing bass. Or they had men singing bass who were hidden or were members of staff, you know, who took a sort of minor role in the operation. Or they said, well, actually, the bass part was transposed up an octave, which is plausible. But the clincher for us was Mickey's research that the bass part was actually sung at pitch by one named person called Anna Del Basso. There is also another woman who we can't quite identify who we think was a bass. I started looking around for women who could sing low. I was sure that there were such people. We tried 2 or 3 people, and then we met Margaret Jackson Roberts, who's got a very deep and powerful voice. We were rehearsing Vivaldi Gloria, and there's a movement that went bom, bom, bom at the end, and she said to me in the middle of rehearsal, would you like a bottomy? And she sang bom, bom, and I can't sing the bottomy. It's that note.
The joys of singing bass are you feel you're the foundation of the choir. We really matter, especially this pioneering venture to prove that women can and do and did sing bass, because that's an important point to prove without being in any way peculiar, except that they can sing low notes. And giving the foundation to the harmony is very important, so that people, and they say they can hear us, and it gives confidence to the rest of the choir. We're not men, of course. We produce our own particular timbre, as I suppose female tenors do.
Personally, I think it's very convincing. After half an hour of singing with our choir in the Pieta, it seemed as if this is how it should be done, and there's no reason to think that anyone should do it any other way. I think it's a bit like going to Venice and seeing the canals, and after half an hour you can't imagine why any town has got roads. And it's the same with Vivaldi's music. One can't imagine why men would have been needed.
It's something you have to rise to, because it's such a new venture. You feel you want to give more than of your best. You want to surpass yourself, both musically and to prove a point to the doubters. And there are people out there, and I've had it happen to me, who will say, you're a freak voice.
A case in point where we hear the low voices is the Gloria Patri of the Dixit Dominus, the penultimate movement, which is a trio for bass, tenor and alto, and we hear them coming in that order. And here we clearly hear the sonority of the low voices, and that's the closest I think we get to solo writing for bass. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritus Sancto, Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritus Sancto, et Spiritus Sancto.
of